if you've paid careful attention to our class title that we announced a few weeks ago, you'll notice that it says the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, part 2. And the part 2 is because many of you were in our first study of Abraham that we did together. My original intent as I started studying Genesis and God really was speaking to me to study this book a little more intensely was that I was going to study Jacob. So as I was studying Jacob, I thought, oh, wow, there's so much here. I'm going to really pour into this, and I can definitely get at least 12 weeks out of this guy. And then God kept saying, no, let's go back here and read a little bit about what this is connected to. And so I started all the way back at the beginning of Abraham's life, and now we are slowly marching our way. Now, I can pretty much assure you that if we all make it here to 12 weeks, we will get to Jacob. But I cannot tell you that we will get through Jacob. So bear with me as the scripture gives us so much that we really have to study over it. And when we come up with something and God speaks to us, I think it's a shame if we hoard that. If we have an insight that God says, hey, I want you to share that with other people, that's what I think he expects us to do. Well, the entirety of our study last time was about Abram's journey to becoming Abraham, about the promise that God had made to him. And we had this man who we had said last time lived in the city of Ur. And this is a reconstruction that archaeologists say that's about what Abram's original home would have looked like. It was a really nice place for the ancient world, a whole lot of really fancy mud brick buildings, lots of water flowing through everything, all kinds of beautiful plants. And then God said, no, you're not going to stay there worshiping these moon gods. I'm going to call you out of here. And this map's a little difficult because it's at a 3/4 perspective there. But down there in the bottom right is Abram's hometown of Ur. And then he's led all the way up there to the top of that map at the south of, a little bit later, Assyria in Haran. And that's where God calls him out to. God says, you're coming out of the nice place to live, and you're going to go live in the desert. You're going to go live in a place that you really probably aren't going to want to be until you meet the God who's leading you there. Because it's great to have all the things of the world, but those things are all passing away, right? That's what 1 John tells us. If you have all of those things, you're only going to be satisfied for a few years. And very quickly, you're going to realize those things aren't going to fill you up. So it's fine that God calls him out here into Haran. This is roughly what it looks like today in the area where Abram was called to. So we had this whole journey where God calls him over there and gives him a promise. What was it that God promised Abram? I heard some things, multitudes. What was some others? Father of many nations. And Genesis 17 is kind of the fullest explanation of that promise. And I'll read that for us. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you, and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan for a perpetual holding, and I will be their God. That's a wonderful promise, right? For a man who is desperate to have children, who has a barren wife, the very first thing that all of us remember, especially because of that wonderful Father Abraham song that we sing so often in children's church, is that God promised him many, many descendants. So that stands out to us. But then I would argue the second thing God promised is the most important thing, right? He says, I'm going to be your God. Because it would have been great if he had just said to Abram, I'm going to give you some children. To a man in the ancient world, and to many today who are desperate for children, just the promise of children would have been a wonderful blessing, right? When he was in Ur, there were no gods that could give him children. There was no one that could help him in that city. And yet it was the God who would become the God of Israel that had promised, I'm going to give you these children. But then he says, not just children, I'm going to be your God. I'm going to be the only God you will worship. You're going to set aside all of these family gods that you guys have all been worshiping. We read last time in Joshua where we were told that Abram was a worshiper of moon gods, that he was a part of this cult that was very popular in ancient Sumer, where they were worshiping the things that God had made instead of the one who made them. And then we finally have the last part of the promise that he is going to give them the land where they are now aliens. That the place where Abram is called out to, God says, I'm going to give you the land under your feet. So we have three different things that God has promised to Abraham as he has his name changed to remember this. Now, God was faithful to the family of Abraham, right? That's why the Bible calls it what it does, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Over and over again throughout the scripture, we see this title that God has claimed for himself. I want you to remember what I was like with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, when you're going through your Bible study, don't just skip ahead of that and think, oh, these are just stories. There's some weird stuff that goes on. There's a pot of beans in there. There's a jar of water. There's some weird burial plot negotiation. All these things are going on, and you can just read through it and you can say, okay, well, this is all kind of weird stuff. Why is God talking to me about this? But God says, wait a minute, read those and see what I did. Read those and see what I was doing for this family all along. See that things kept happening. Because a lot of the time, if you're reading Genesis and most of those first 5 books of the Bible, you'll have kind of an Esther moment, right? Where it will say, perhaps you were put here for such a time as this, right? That God is almost hinting at it and wants you to have to do the homework. He's going to tell you the story, and then he wants you to have to think about it, to pray about it, to have to go, ooh, what does that mean, God? Why are you telling me that story? Because he doesn't give you the kind of thing that we love so much in the New Testament, where it just tells you, this is what happened, this is what it means. If we get that, we like it, right? It's very easy. It's what Peter tells us is the milk, right? We all like that milk that's easy to process. We can just understand what's going on. We can get really excited about it because it makes us able to get it even if we're tired. Even if we're really struggling to read that night, we can still read the New Testament. We can pretty much understand what it's saying. But when it comes to some of the Old Testament stories, we have to work a little bit. We have to chew. We have to digest. We have to say, all right, let's see what this is together. So that's what we're going to try to do in this class, is to constantly keep our eye on the God. It's not going to be just about the men, or even in some of these stories about the women or the servants or whoever else is involved. We've always, as we read, got to be thinking, what's God doing in here? Why is he telling me this story? What's he really wanting me to learn in the midst of all of this? So tonight we're going to pick back up with Abraham's story. Now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time with Abraham, but Genesis doesn't leave Abraham alone when we would probably think that he should, right? Life's kind of messy that way, where the last time we studied Abraham, if you remember, we studied what the Hebrews call the binding of Isaac, this effort where Abraham was going to be obedient to God and sacrifice this promised son. Abraham said, all right, I'm going to do exactly what God told me. And that's where we ended our study. But then Genesis says, no, Abraham's still alive. Abraham's still got a purpose. So he's going to have a few more events that we want to study together. And family stories are like that, right? When you retire, when you've moved on past being in the center of the spotlight of your family, sometimes it can feel a little weird where you still got a role. You're still doing things, but now you're not in the center of the stage anymore. And we'll see what happens with Abraham as he does that. But as our evangelist told us last week, if you're alive, God has a purpose for you, right? He is intending for you to do something if he has you still on this earth. So Abraham will linger for a few more chapters and will still make a difference. So we're going to start off by reading in Genesis 22, 20 through 24. And I told Jenny that I'm going to read this one because specifically it's a genealogy, and I don't want to open the class asking somebody else to read a genealogy. If you want to feel really excited about it, you want to go for it, Hannah? All right, Hannah, let's go with it. Read loud. 22, 20 through 24.
Sometime later, Abraham was told, Milcah is also a mother. She has borne sons to your brother Nahor, Uz the firstborn, Buz his brother, Himuel the father of Aram, Hesed, Hasso, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. Milcah bore these 8 sons to Abraham's brother Nahor. His concubine, whose name was Reumah, also had sons, Teba, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah.
All right.
Yeah.
That was a great job.
Yeah.
Really appreciate you there.
You said what authority.
So we immediately jump back. As soon as Isaac is safe, Abraham is doing just fine, we go to a genealogy. Right in the middle of this story, Abraham's doing everything God said, and then God says, no, hang on a minute. Before we go any further, you need to know about these people who are having children way back over here in Sumer. These people that stayed in the area that Abraham was called out of. God says, there's something going on back there that I need to tell you about. Now, this guy, Nahor, Abram's brother, was only mentioned in 3 verses back in Genesis 11, and it's basically the same kind of thing as we get in Genesis 22, where it's just a genealogy. So all we get is Nahor has this family. And then we wait about 11 chapters, and we come to the same kind of thing. Nahor has some children over here. That's kind of weird, right? That we go with this 11 chapter break, and the only reason this guy gets mentioned is because he's having children over here. We get this long genealogy surrounding all of these people because God wants it to be very clear to you that he cares about everything in your life and in your history. When you read something like that and you're struggling through it, if you've stayed up a little too late, it's 10:30, 11 o'clock, you got to work early in the morning, you open your Bible and you see, oh great, genealogy. That's what I was really hoping for tonight. What I want you to remember is God cares about where you came from. God cares about everything related to you and everyone who's ever been related to you. And he put these genealogies in there so that he can say, look, it's not just the main characters that matter. It's not just the people who are at the center of the action that are going to be important to God and what he's doing. He's doing stuff all the time in places you would never suspect. And so when you read those genealogies, think, God, teach me to understand that the things I consider are insignificant matter to you, that you're doing something. The Lord never wastes anything in the lives of his followers. Verse 20 tells us that after the near death of Isaac, Abraham was told that his brother was fruitful and well. Now, we have no idea who told him that. Was it the angel that had been just talking to him a few verses earlier? Did some servant show up or a tradesperson of some kind? We don't know. All we get is Abraham was doing exactly what God said, and then somebody shows up and says, hey, just let you know, your brother, way back over here, hundreds of miles away, he had some children, and they had some children. And so you've got this connection where Abraham is suddenly thinking about where he came from. In the midst of his old age, he's suddenly going, wait a minute, I wonder how they're doing over there. I wonder what God's been doing here. So why does God suddenly tell us in the midst of all this story about the birth of Rebekah? Rebekah's story is still over a chapter away. Why does he just insert this right here in the middle? Okay, but why did he tell us now? Why didn't he wait? You know, so many times we get the introduction and then we get the story of the person. But we get Rebekah early. And so it's almost like God wanted to make clear that Abraham heard early. Before he even knew that Rebekah was going to be his daughter-in-law, God says, hey, just let you know, this girl's born over here. Why do you think he did that?
Part of the promise, maybe?
Yeah. I think he's wanting to get his mind churning. Now, I find that God does that for me a lot. God will give me a little bit of information and then nothing else. He will tell me something and he'll say, hey, keep an eye on that. And I'll go, well, okay, can you tell me why? No, I'm not going to tell you why. Just pay attention. And when God does something like that, I think it makes us a little excited, right?
Yeah.
Everybody loves a secret. Everybody enjoys it when somebody comes up and says, hey, did you know there's something that's really important that's going to happen in 2 days? I mean, you might just think the person's crazy, but if you are hearing from God, you're probably going to go, well, I better pay attention in 2 days, right? I better be looking around. So I think what God's doing is planting the seed in Abraham's mind. He wants him to be kind of uncomfortable spiritually. He wants him to be thinking as he's going through his life, he's still got years before he's going to have anything to do with Rebekah. But he wants that to be rattling around in our little pea brains and thinking, Didn't I have a relative over here who had a child? Somebody told me about that. God has never forgotten his plans for you. Even when it seems like those have been set aside, right? Even when it seems like that's taking longer than what you would expect, when it seems like it's just kind of random, when God has spoken something over your life and then it's not happened, God didn't forget. God didn't get busy doing something else. He wasn't distracted. He's doing exactly what he plans to do. But what Abraham teaches us is that God knew what he was doing with Rebekah way before Abraham knew. God's putting that out there and saying, hey, this is going to matter. And let you know, I'm the God all the way over here in Ur. I'm still the God who can do things while you have no idea that anything's going on. God will often let you know something that seems small, but it will be important. Be sensitive to the Spirit's leadership. Isaiah 30:21 says, and when you turn to the right or when you turn to the left, your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. And Revelation 3:22 says, let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Now you can go into those and say, oh, well, these things are about specific contexts. But I guarantee you that those are really going to be useful to you if you obey them as commands. Because if you listen to what the Spirit is doing, you will follow exactly what God has for your life. But the Bible is true to life. So right in the middle of this story, here we are. We're reading genealogies. We're trying to keep our eyes open, and we're thinking, man, this is dry. We haven't got any stories, God. You can't tell me something about a talking mule. You can't tell me something that's going to be exciting about your power or the joy that's coming. Just genealogy. And then, just like in life, everything's going just fine. And all of a sudden, an unexpected death, right? When that happens in life, it's very difficult, right? When you think that today is just like any other day, just like these young people who went to school this morning, you think this is just a regular day. And then all of a sudden, tragedy strikes. And your life is totally different. You have to adjust. So if someone could please read for us Genesis 23, 1 through 2. Just the first two verses of chapter 23.
Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebrew, in the land of Canaan. Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her.
All right, so the Bible tells us that they waited 25 years before they got their child. So that tells most scholars that they were married for at least 70 years. That's a pretty long time, right? If you have a 70th wedding anniversary, that's pretty rare in the modern world.
Yes.
And you think, that's pretty tough. I know some of you have gone through the loss of a spouse. I know that that's a really tough time. When you've lived with somebody for decades, when every day they're there, and you wish you could fight with them one more time, it's a difficult adjustment, right? It's going to challenge everything about how you're going to see your life for a little while. Now in Genesis 6:3, way back around the time of the flood, God placed a general limit on human lifespans. He said, you will have, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. That's what the scripture says. And so most people have pointed out, if you notice, Sarah lives 127 years. And most people have pointed out, well, this must mean that God is signaling with her lifespan that she's an especially precious woman to him. Because she not only lives longer than the general allotment, she gets the perfect number of 7 added to it. So they say this is a sign that God is giving to Abraham that he was very well pleased with his wife. God rewards our faithfulness. We don't always get exactly what we want. We don't get it exactly the way we want it, but God will reward your faithfulness. You can trust that his blessings are coming. We were never given any warning about Sarah's death, though. There was no mention of her for the last several chapters. During Isaac's trial with Abraham, where he is bound to be sacrificed, during this period where Abraham is living by himself, right over here near the edge of this territory, there's no mention of her. We have no idea what their life looked like. We know he's a traveling shepherd, so it could be that her health declines. We don't know why she seems to not be traveling with him, but we find out that she is in a different region that's just next door from where we were last told he's living. That doesn't mean they weren't living together, but it could have meant that. She hasn't appeared directly in any story since Hagar and Ishmael were sent away. There's not been any mention of this woman. Abraham had to endure the heartache of almost sacrificing his son all by himself. There's no mention of Sarah at all in that story. And now Isaac is not mentioned when his mother dies. Now that doesn't mean Isaac isn't there. It's just saying that the scripture is emphasizing that Abraham is facing this individually. It means that all of us, when we face grief, when we face depression, when we face difficulties in life, you may be surrounded by people, but you're still facing it individually. It's still going to be you and God. And you either are going to get through it with God or you're not going to get through it at all, because no one is going to be able to get you through something like the death of a spouse you've been married to for 70 years except God. So, there's never a time when it's going to be easy for us to lose somebody special to us, right? There's not any point where, even if you've had a long illness, even if you really are discouraged and having all kinds of struggles, there's never a point where you're going to go, okay, God, this is going to be just fine. Even if you're ready to let go, it's still going to be difficult. There's still going to be all kinds of extra challenges that you didn't foresee. It can feel like everything important's been ripped right out of us. Now, I suspect Abraham was feeling this way when, just like today, you have to face all of a sudden a whole lot of weird business decisions in the midst of your grief, right? You don't get to just sit around because you've got a dead body to deal with. Dead bodies don't wait around for us to be ready. They move on very quickly. Even with refrigeration, you've got a very short period of time. But if you think about a period 4,000 years ago, you didn't have much time. It was time, in the desert, you better be moving along. I suspect Abraham felt at this extremely low point when he has to make these burial arrangements. Can somebody read verses 3 and 4 for us?
Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife, and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead.
All right. So why does he want to bury his dead out of his sight? It doesn't just mean anywhere under the ground. It means I want her a distance away. I think that's exactly right. I think that Abraham is having so much pain with this that he can't go out there and look at her grave every day. He can't just put her in the ground next to his tent and say, oh, that'll be fine. It's too much of a burden for him. So he's desperate that Sarah is out of his sight. Now, the custom for most of human history has been that you bury your dead on family land. That's been almost everywhere in the world, that if you own any property, you bury your dead on your own family land. Very recently, the last 500 to 600 years, people started making these public places called cemeteries that we all share and we all use together so that we can put our dead all in one place. But for most of the history of humanity, it's been that you buried them out in the backyard, out in some pasture somewhere that you happen to own. Why is that a problem for Abraham? If you needed to bury someone on some land you owned, why is that an issue? Yeah. He doesn't own any land. That's a problem, right? If you're supposed to bury it in land you own, and you don't have any, what are you going to do? You got to buy some, right? You got to do something else. Now, they didn't have somebody who was saying, hey, have you thought about what you're going to do when your wife passes away? I don't know if he had ever thought of this. I doubt it. I bet he was just going along doing life thinking, well, everything's going to be fine. All of a sudden, Sarah drops dead. And Acts 7:5, we have a discussion where the Pastor Stephen is talking about this, and he says, he, that is God, did not give him any of it, the land, as a heritage, not even a foot's length, but promised to give it to him as his possession and to his descendants after him. Now, God has given him the promise. God said, this is going to be your land. You look out here, all this place that I've brought you through, all of it is going to be the descendants of yours. They're going to own every single bit of it. Now, that promise is really great, isn't it? I mean, it's incredible to think about that kind of scale. The country of Israel is a pretty small place from a national perspective, right? It's not a huge country. But if you think about just walking through that and God telling you all this land is going to belong to your people, that'd be pretty special, right? I hear a lot of people that'll talk about things and they'll say, man, I'd just really like to have some property somewhere. I'd really enjoy it if I could have 30 or 40 acres. Well, if God's going to give you a country, that'd probably be enough, right? And yet, he's got a problem. He's got a promise, but he's got no land. Not even a foot's length, Stephen tells us. He can't even bury a mouse in the land that he owns. So he has a difficult issue. He's a nomad. That doesn't mean he's poor. We find out that Abraham is actually very rich, that he has an extreme amount of money, so much that a lot of people in the area get nervous when Abraham comes into town. They go, man, this guy's got so much money, he could just about buy anything around here. This is a problem. So you see those little spats where he's getting into it with people because of his influence, but he doesn't own any of it. Now, what we're told in Acts is that God didn't give it to him. Now, we don't get told why that was. We aren't told why God told him, don't buy any land. Because, I think most of us, if we come from a city and we have millions of dollars, we're probably going to want some place that we own, right? Most of us, if we have all that money where everybody is thinking, man, he could afford anything he wants in this area, then we're going to go get ourselves some property and build us a house. But he never does that. And I have to assume that's because Acts tells us God didn't give it to him. I think Abraham was following God. Abraham was listening to what God was leading him to do, and God never led him to buy any of this land. He had the promised land under his feet. He's believed God for it. I'm confident that Abraham believed that the land that he lived on would be owned by his descendants. But he has to go and ask permission to use a little cave that nobody's using. That's a difficult part, right? He calls himself a sojourner in some of the older translations and a resident alien in some of the newer translations. He's telling them, I don't belong here. I know it, you know it. I'm not supposed to be here, but God's brought me here. In my natural, I don't think I should be here. But the Lord led me here, so I'm going to be here. And that puts him in a challenging spot. He has no permanent home, but they make it clear he's not just a nomad. They see a difference in Abraham. Could somebody read verses 5 and 6?
The Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead.
All right. So they tell him, hey, we can see that you are a special guy. We can see that you've got things going on that we can't understand, but we know that someone is with you. Someone is blessing you. So you pick any place you want for a tomb. What do they call him when they make him this offer? Prince? Anybody got any other translations? My Lord. You may have a note in your Bible if you're using any kind of digital Bible, or if you've got it down at the bottom there, it may tell you what the Hebrew actually says, because what they tell him is, you are a prince of God. You are somebody who God has his hand on. Now that's special, right? That's pretty amazing when the people that you live around, your neighbors, when you're moving around, they don't get to know you very well. Now, maybe they got a few interactions as he was bringing his animals around and around, and they got to talk with him enough times that they really understood that. But I think that Abraham was so recognizable because of his relationship with God that it jumped out at people. I think when he was interacting with them, if he went down there to buy some sheep food, they said, whoa, something is up with this guy. I don't know what it is. I don't know who's dealing with him, but something special is happening with this man. And so they say, you are a prince of God. They recognize something is incredibly special about him. And when people get to know you, they should recognize that you're royalty. Have you guys ever watched any of the interactions with the royal family over there in England? There are some people they call the royal watchers, and they're just obsessed with it. They want to know everything about where they're going. They want to know what they're wearing. They want to know all about that stuff. But you know what you don't see very often, when I have ever seen a king or a prince walking around, is that they walk up to somebody and they say, hey, just to let you know, I'm the king in this area. Thought you might want to know. They don't do that. They don't bother, right? They got heralds sometimes. They got people that come out and say, the king is coming, or everyone make way for the king. They got people who recognize it. But you don't have the royals going around bragging about who they are, right? It's just obvious. When you're in the presence of royalty, you know it. Everybody's reacting differently. Everybody is changed when you're around royalty, because all of a sudden there's all this murmuring. There's all this excitement where people are going, hey, did you know there's a prince in town? Do you have any idea what he's able to do? What authority he has? What he can connect you to if you get to know the prince? God says you are royalty. That the same kind of power that was on Abraham's life should be on your life. When you're walking around, it should be obvious to people that they're with royalty. It shouldn't be something where you have to say, hey, if you don't know, I'm a child of the Most High King, so that technically makes me a co-heir with Christ, and that means I'm going to get everything that Jesus Christ had. That's great if you need to say that to people. But it should be dripping off of you. It should be so obvious that when people walk up to you, they go, what? You're a prince or princess of God. I can recognize that anywhere because there's nothing like God, right? There's no confusion. There's no foolishness where people will say, oh, all religions lead to the same God. Hokum! Nobody will get confused if they have an encounter with the true God. Nobody's going to have some kind of confusion where they go, I wonder if that person believes in Jesus, or they believe in Muhammad, or they believe in Buddha. There's not going to be any of that. Because if you are close to God, the royalty is going to show. They're going to immediately say, something is different about these people. Something is totally different than any other kind of people. My slideshow has gone backwards on me. I apologize for that. I think I clicked the wrong thing. There we go. In 1 Peter 2:9, he says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. You are a priest of God with his royal seal on you. God lives inside of you, and if people don't know it, it's a problem, right? Christians are resident aliens. We're just like Abraham. We're wandering around wherever God leads us. We're doing, hopefully, whatever God tells us to do. But you're a person that's far from home. You're not getting closer until God takes your last breath. You can be in his presence, but you're not going to be home until God says, that's it. While you're visiting a place, you realize pretty quickly you don't belong there, right? If you guys have ever been on a longer trip, if you've stayed with family, if you've just had to work somewhere for a good long period of time, you have to stay for a week, 2 week, 3 week, whatever that is, after a pretty quick amount of time, you go, wait a minute, this isn't home. These people are different. Everything about the place is different. I really don't belong here. And that's how you should feel everywhere you are on this earth. You should, as a Christian, constantly have that uneasiness where you go, man, this just isn't where I belong. I'm really not supposed to be here long term. I'm supposed to be here until God is done, but I don't belong here. If you find yourselves amazed at the news, if you see another school shooting and you go, goodness, what's this world coming to? Answer yourself exactly what God said it would. This world is going to end in destruction. The entire thing is going to come apart. So don't be surprised as you see it coming apart. God told you that was going to happen. He told you that this place that's falling apart is not where you have to live. You don't have to deal with all of this stuff. Abraham knew he wasn't home yet. He said, I'm a resident alien. And the Hittites knew he isn't home. They say, you're a prince of God. If you feel at home here, pray about it. Tell God, make me uneasy. I don't want to feel at home here because this world is ending in destruction. Now we've got 9 verses about a land deal. Now I don't think any of y'all are going to be extremely excited to read this, but I need one of you to volunteer to read us 9 verses of real estate transaction. Hannah's ready. She's wanting all the challenging verses. Let's go with it.
What verse is it?
It's 7 through 16.
All right. Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites. He said to them, if you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of his city. No, my lord, he said, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said, Ephron, in their hearing, listen to me if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants.
All right, thank you very much. So these men are going back and forth. It feels like we're a little bit in the weeds, right? We've just had a pretty great pronouncement that God has showed us. Wait a minute, Abraham has something special about him. He's got this power of God on him. And then we get this pretty exhaustive list of all of the things they said. And we go, wait a minute, that's not fair, God. You know all the times that I've been reading in the New Testament and I say, wait, what did God actually do there? What did Jesus do when he was over here? Can you just tell me a little bit more about that? And then God gives you all of this negotiation. Now, it's probably not word for word, moment for moment, but it's a lot, right? The back and forth. We've got Ephron coming over here saying, hey, I'll give it to you. And Abram saying, no, you won't give it to me. And then they're bickering over the price. Why does Genesis spend so much time on a burial plot negotiation? I think you're exactly right, Miss Nancy. I think that's exactly right of why we get the payment. But why do we get all the discussion? Okay, yeah. Because God knows what we need, right? Even when we don't know what we need, even when we go, man, God, I just wish you would be a little different than this or that. God is saying, pay attention. This transaction matters more than you think it does. Because when you're reading it, you can go, okay, I get it. Old man's wife died. He buried her in this spot. Let's move on. And God says, no, this is my precious anointed one. This is the wife of him who I selected to be the father of all my people. So you're going to pay attention to what goes on here, and you're going to see what he's doing here, because Abraham is still teaching us a lesson in the midst of this negotiation. What's the original asking price? What does this Ephron the Hittite say? No, before that, at the very beginning, yeah, free. I mean, is there any price better than free?
Doesn't come for free.
Oh, yeah, you're a wise woman. You've lived a little bit of time. And as Miss Nancy said, stuff happens when people give you things, doesn't it? You might want to ask the Native Americans what happens when somebody gives you something and then decides to change the terms a little bit later on.
Give you a free pet.
Ephron says in verse 11, I give you the field. It's free. You can have it in the presence of the people. Everybody's hearing me say, I'm going to give it to you. But Abraham knows there's something special that has to be done. So in verse 13, he kind of sounds fussy to me. He says, if you will only listen to me, I'm going to buy it. That's what I came here to tell you. I asked if I could buy it, and I'm not going to have it as a gift. I have told you I'm going to purchase this cave. He demands to pay full price. Now, there's not a whole lot of people I've encountered like that. If somebody walks up to someone and says, hey, I'll give you this for free, and they say, oh, no, you won't. Full price or nothing. That's an unusual behavior. I was hoping that our brother Jeff Davis would be here for that moment. But if somebody had offered Jeff Davis something for free, you had better believe he's not pulling his wallet out unless God tells him to do it. But he wanted this to be his wife's burial plot forever. He didn't want this to be something that somebody else could say, well, you know what? My dad gave that to Abraham. He didn't pay anything to our family, so I'm going to take it back. I'm going to do my own thing. Because it's not just about the burial site of Sarah, right? If you know the story of Genesis, you will find out that all the way down to Joseph, they're still saying, hey, let's make sure that the bones get back to this place that Abraham bought. Because this place matters. The history of the world tells us that people go back on their gifts. So Ephron agrees. The price will be 400 shekels. Now, compared to today's land prices, that may still seem cheap. If you know anything about shekels, which you probably don't, it means that this plot of land would have been 100 pounds of silver. 100 pounds of silver in today's price is about $40,000 to $50,000, which is a lot of money, right? Nobody's going to look at that 100 pounds of silver and think, you can just keep it. We'll just be fine without it. They would want that 100 pounds of silver. But silver was worth a lot more in Abraham's day. Now, if you know anything about your history, if you remember any of that stuff that people taught you, like my beautiful wife here who has to talk about the Code of Hammurabi every year. She has to talk about the Code of Hammurabi and try to get these poor little 12-year-olds to understand what an ancient Babylonian king was doing with this Code of Hammurabi. That code is about 100 years different in time than Abraham's life. And it tells us that minimum wage for a regular worker was 10 shekels a year. So, if you get 10 shekels a year, and this little cave is 400, it's a lot of money, right? Even if you just do a minimum wage worker salary today, that's $580,000 for a minimum wage worker to get up to 400 shekels. That's a lot of money that Abraham has pulled out his wallet and said, you're not giving me this. $600,000 almost. And he says, you're going to take it. I insist that you take this money. Wow. That is an act of faith, right? And then Ephron, I assume, is being serious when he says at the end there, what's 400 shekels between you and me? If you insist that I have it, I'll take it. No problem. I'll take the money. Is that because Abraham is so rich that that really is a small amount of money to him? Or is Ephron trying to be a jokester? We don't really know. But he takes the money. He takes this 400 shekels. So again, why are we talking about this? Why is God teaching us about a cave way over there near Hebron in Israel? 4,000 years ago, we're dealing with the negotiation for buying a grave. Remember that God promised Abraham that his descendants will get the land for free. God offered all of it to them as a gift. But Abraham has to pay a lot for what's equivalent to a postage stamp, right? If you look at all of Israel, and then you go today to this area where the Muslims claim they know exactly where this cave is, if you go to that area, you can see this temple that they've built over this cave and go, I don't know. I mean, it's just a hole in the ground. I don't know if I would have paid $600,000 for that. But it foreshadows what happened to the Israelites. The land they took was gained exactly like God predicted, not by their effort, but by their obedience. Ephron sells a bit of land for a lot of money. God gives them all the land, but wants all their worship. He says, you don't have to do anything except worship me. But the Hittites still own the land in Abraham's day. And Abraham is paying a down payment of faith. It's great when we say we believe God, but it's different when our life shows it. We can tell everybody how much we trust in the promises of God, but your life will reflect it, one way or another. Hebrews tells us about what Abraham's life was like. In Hebrews 11, 9 through 10, it says, by faith he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Abraham didn't want his family buried in Ur or in Egypt or some random plot. He said, I'm going to have my family buried in the promised land. We are going to be there. When God gives us this land, I want everyone to be able to come over to my grave and say, this is where our ancestor was promised. This is the spot where he said, I'm going to put the money down. God had warned him he wouldn't own one handful of promised land dirt during his lifetime, but his descendants would own it all. Abraham put his money where his mouth was, and so he bought a burial place for his family. He's buying this land. If somebody will read verses 17 through 20, we'll hear how he gets it.
So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which is to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, throughout its whole area, passed to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, in the presence of all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre, that is, Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it passed from the Hittites into Abraham's possession as a burying place.
So the key words there are at the very end of that set of verses, as a burying place. Because he doesn't get to use this land to build himself a house on. He doesn't have all this money and then think, you know what, I'd really like a palace. And now I've got a field over here beside this cave I buried my wife in. I own it, so I can use it. But what you'll find is in the ancient world, just like today, people are allowed to specify what you can use the land for, right? If they sell you mineral rights, it's not the same as you having a complete ownership of the whole land. Abraham is entitled to bury his family on this land. That's it. That's all he can use it for. So he's investing in a promise that he knows he will not live to see fulfilled. That's a really difficult thing to do, right? If God asks you to spend your time and money investing in something you won't live to see, that's a tough ask. It's difficult for us to be committed to something when we say, God, let me see the end. Like Moses, right? God, let me get across here. Moses was so desperate, just let me put my foot on the land on the other side of the Jordan. And God says, nope. You're going to do all the work to get them there, but you're not going to get to cross over. Because I decide who goes where and for how long. And Abraham invested in this promise. In Hebrews 11, 13 through 16, all of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. So, these people die without getting the promise, right? We don't like that. We want the promise. We want the fulfillment of the promise. And some of us are tempted when we deal with that reality that God has given you a promise and he has told you you're not going to see it fulfilled to turn back. As Hebrews tells us, they could have gone back to Ur, right? They could have said, you know what, I'm really tired of this lifestyle. I'm an old man. My wife is dead. I've heard about my family. They're still over there. They're doing well. I'm rich. Can you imagine how glad they would be to see me if I come in here and I've got all these millions of dollars? They're just going to be thrilled and we're going to have a great party. But they knew, you better not go back there. They didn't return to that land because they knew that wasn't their home. If you know where your home is, you're going to be pressing toward it. It's not where you're born. It's not where you're most comfortable on this earth. It's not your happy place that social media talks about. It's the place of joy. It's the place of the glory of the Lord. And if you're pressing to that, you're going to have a totally different perspective. Do you believe God's promise for eternity enough to invest in it? That's what Abraham's story is asking you. Would you be willing to take $600,000 that God has given you and put it in a hole in the ground? Because God said, this is where I want your body to be. I want your bones to be here so that when my people come here, they can know that I've been faithful for the last 400 years. That just like they found out that God was faithful to the people of Ur when he was taking care of Rebekah, while Abraham was far, far away, the people of God needed to know when they got to the promised land, Abraham was already waiting. He was sitting right there in the ground, having given that down payment of faith, saying, I trust God is going to get his people to my gravesite. I trust this is going to matter 400 years from now. Generations down the road, what God is doing in my life is going to count. Are you willing to invest in something for the kingdom that may not come to fruition for 400 years? I don't think that the Lord's going to tarry for 400 years, but I'm not God. He may have something in mind that will cost you so much that you would never believe it. And he may ask you, will you put this into the kingdom? And you're not going to see the result. Because if you know Abraham's story well, God told him it was going to be 400 years. God said, the promise is going to come true, but it will take 400 years. So Abraham is saying, I trust you, God, that in 400 years, this is going to matter. It matters to me today because of the faith, but it's going to matter a lot more to them in the future because they're going to know that their ancestor confessed the name of the Lord, that he was pressing in to home. Invest in your home. When you're hurting, when you're burdened, when you're grieving, that's the time to invest in your home. Hebrews 13:14 says, for here, that is on earth, we have no lasting city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. From a distance, look up to the city. While you're dealing with all the challenges of daily life, press to the city. Don't worry about what happens to your earthly tent, this little place that you live as a resident alien doing the work of God. Desire a better country. Desire the city of God that he has prepared for you. Anybody have questions or comments?